everyone, Gaara here and welcome to the very first episode of my third brand new series, which I like to call Deck Analysis. This series I wanna focus on all sorts of different archetypes and mostly on archetypes that are not viable, analyze and dissect the archetype and talk about why these archetypes don't see any play or what these decks are missing to see play or to be viable. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So in today's episode I want to talk about the Freeze Shaman. You might have never seen an actual Freeze Shaman being played on ladder, but there's plenty of cards, also cards that have been in the most recent expansion, Knights of the Frozen Throne, a bunch of new cards. Actually most of the new Shaman cards are supporting the new Freeze Shaman archetype. Here you guys can see most of the cards that would support the Freeze Shaman archetype. Yeah, what is there to say about these cards? What is the issue with those cards? Why do we not see Freeze Shaman being played? So the very first issue there is the natural unbalance between the power level of the existing classes. So this is no longer a big secret that there's like way more Druid being played on the ladder than any of the other classes. It goes up to 60% at times. So the average is between 40 and 50% popularity. Even though we have 9 different classes, we see 50% Druid in terms of popularity, which is ridiculous. So there has to be something wrong, right? So Druid is by far the strongest class in terms of power level. It didn't just randomly appear out of nowhere. Druid was already tier 1 before Knights of the Frozen Throne was released. Jade Druid was a very powerful deck, so was Aggro Druid, and they got the most support with the current expansion. Existing powerful archetypes got the strongest cards added to their arsenal, and the other classes or archetypes just fell short. If you give existing tier 1 decks the biggest power boost, there's no surprise that if you want to create a new archetype with here the Freeze Shaman, that you have to print such powerful cards that can compete with the existing tier 1 decks. But on top of it, if you are going to buff the existing tier 1 decks, you have to make these cards even more powerful, or the synergy even more powerful, that you can compete with them. And this is unfortunately not the case, and it's very far from being the case with the Freeze Shaman. The individual win rate of all these cards is way below average. They go down up to under 30%, which is crazy bad. They're competing with the worst cards in Hearthstone, and that is obviously really bad if you wanna make a Freeze Shaman viable. But not just that, if the cards are individually terrible, you have to make up with synergy. If you go back to the mech synergy, all the mech cards were fairly decent. They were just slightly below average or average in terms of power level. We had cards like the Mech Warper, for example, which was a 2 mana 2/3 that reduced the mana cost of other mechs by 1. So you have a slightly below average minion even at that time, but a huge upswing if you play mechs. And there were some mechs like the Piloted Shredder which were above average and which were like extremely powerful in a mech synergy deck. And this is why a lot of mech decks reached at least tier 2 in power level. Since every single Freeze Shaman card is way below average, they're like not even close to being average in terms of individual power level, the synergy has to be extremely powerful to make up for the individual bad power level, right? So if we look at all these cards, Glacial Shard, Icebreaker, Brawler, Cryostasis, Avalanche, all these cards have like freeze something or take advantage of a minion being frozen. So these cards don't really have any obvious synergy. One very important thing in Hearthstone is if you're not playing a strictly combo oriented deck like Freeze Mage or Patron Warrior, you really want to curve out in Hearthstone right now just to be able to compete with the other decks. Even the control decks are very curve heavy right now, like Jade decks for example, or Control Paladin. Like even the Burn Control Mage is trying to curve out. So basically if you want to compete with other decks, you have to play in curve, which the Freeze Mage or the Freeze Shaman is obviously not doing, because you're playing extremely weak minions if you would play them on curve, like the Glacial Shard or the Burlock. But even if you would play them in curve, usually the effect to freeze something has like no real upside. For example, you don't really want to freeze something on turn 1 with the Glacial Shard, so you want to hold these cards. So if you're not playing these cards in curve, even if you would play them in curve, they're so understated that yeah, they would die fairly easy to any of the opponent's minions, like the Glacial Shard or the Burlock. Like, all these cards are super understated. If you would play them in curve, you don't really have clear follow-up to that as well, right? As you guys can see, the synergy is not there. If I freeze with a Glacial Shard on turn 1, as soon as your next turn begins, the minion will be unfrozen, right? So you cannot just freeze something and then equip the Icebreaker the following turn and then take out that minion, because he's already unfrozen. So you first have to equip the Icebreaker and then to freeze something, and then you can take it out. You cannot play stuff in curve. But besides that, there is really no power spikes or overall synergies. So the overall idea is to take out minions with the Icebreaker and freeze them. But this is extreme counter synergetic. You don't usually wanna kill a minion that you freeze. You wanna ignore it. That's the whole point of freezing something. And the way how freeze and Icebreaker works, you freeze that minion and you have to kill it immediately, else it gets unfrozen. But that's not how you wanna utilize the freeze effect. You wanna ignore the minion. So this is already a very big counter synergy. So the cards themselves don't have synergy. Individually, the power level is crazy low from these cards like Glacial Shards or Burlock. Extremely counter synergetic Icebreaker with the overall freeze effect. And the cards itself are super bad and super weird. For example, let's take a look at Avalanche. Avalanche is just an extremely bad card. I tested it in many different free Shaman decks. And you never have a situation where you wanna get the full value out of an Avalanche. You really wanna freeze the main body. First of all, it's very easy to play around Avalanche as soon as you know the opponent is playing actual free Shaman. Second of all, you always wanna damage the main body usually. And you know, oftentimes there was missing something. You wanna either freeze all 3 targets, but it's so weird to freeze the main body and just deal damage to the adjacent ones. Usually you want to either freeze all of them or deal a lot of damage to the main body. It's almost never good to just freeze the main body and deal damage to adjacent ones. On top of it, the card is completely useless if your opponent just plays 1 minion. If your opponent plays 1 minion, you basically just freeze it for 4 mana, which is super terrible. I don't even want to get started taking a closer look at cards like Frostshock, which are obviously extremely bad cards, or cards like Frost Elemental. So we basically play a lot of cards that would not even see play at vanilla Hearthstone just because of how poorly they are statted. The only real card that has a lot of synergy with the freeze effect is Morabi, but it's close to impossible to pull it off just because of how fast-paced Hearthstone is. And usually Shaman or Control Shaman doesn't really struggle with value. You have the Jades to take advantage of that, or the Spirit Echoes, or yeah, like Elemental Shaman even. These freeze Shaman cards can't even compete with the other Shaman class cards. Like, if your other class cards are stronger than these cards, the only way to make them playable or to make up for that is to make the synergy crazy. And I absolutely don't see any synergy between these cards that is remotely playable or viable. The next point is the most important point. What is the overall game plan of this free Shaman deck? So whenever you build a new deck or any deck, the first thing you should think of or keep in mind is the overall strategy. Like, what is your deck trying to do? And this is how you improve the deck list after playing games. Like, you know what you're trying to do, and you're trying to substitute bad performing cards with better performing cards, or potentially better performing cards that fit or suit your overall game plan. And the overall game plan of free Shaman is just non-existent. Like, what are you actually trying to do? Your win condition of that archetype would probably be to get infinite amount of value from Morabi. But how realistic is that? You have to save so many cheap freeze cards like the Glacial Shard and play them together with the Morabi and just copy a bunch of minions But then Spirit Echo is just so much better and more reliable because you don't have to freeze a minion. The cards are extremely bad as a standalone. Cards like Burlock or Icebreaker. Icebreaker is like a free mana Light Justice essentially. They're like all just very poor statted cards. Cards with very bad effects. And there's no synergy between them. And there is no clear win condition. Even in my wildest dreams, I just can't see how any free Shaman deck could work in any way or form. Like, you need to have at least some sort of win condition, like an obvious win condition. There has to be like an 8-9 mana card that just kind of wins through the game if you have frozen, like, let's say 8 minions during the game. You froze 8 minions during the game, you play your 8 mana card and it says I won the game. Then you have a clear game plan. You wanna freeze as many minions as possible. You can lose the game because you play all these bad cards. Just like a win condition, right? Like, this deck will just try to freeze your opponents till you ultimately lose the game, right? Because you will run out of resources, you play really bad cards, and on top of it, the only real good card would be the Icebreaker if you can consistently free something. But Shaman is one of the classes with the least amount of healing. You don't really wanna, let's say your opponent plays a giant and then you freeze it and face tank it with the Icebreaker. Yes, you took it out, but you really can't afford to take face damage usually as Shaman, just because you have close to no healing. Bad in so many different ways. What is my conclusion from this? As we have seen in the past, Blizzard really wants to make these new archetypes playable. We have seen this time and time again with the Beast Druid. They've added multiple beast cards with every expansion since they started pushing the Beast Druid archetype, and the same happened with the Control Hunter. I believe it goes back as far as almost 2 years since they tried to make the Control Hunter work with cards like Dynasize and whatnot. Control Hunter is still very far from playable, and what I'm really afraid of right now is that Blizzard will push the Freeze Shaman in future expansions without even knowing what the Freeze Shaman is lacking. And the biggest problem is definitely not more freeze cards. Like, we are not really struggling with adding enough cards that are freezing something. When I was playing Freeze Shaman, I was actually cutting a lot of these freeze cards. You just don't need to freeze that many times. And I'm afraid that they will just add more cards that just freeze something. But what are we gonna do with that? Like, there's no point in just endlessly freezing something. What this archetype really needs is a clear win condition, something we work towards to, like either like a crazy amount of value or a clear win condition. As I said, just win the game, similar to the quest. There should be like a quest that supports the freeze archetype, something we work towards to, and then we can win the game, similar to the Jades, for example. And yeah, this is my conclusion from that, and I hope it was like any helpful. And that's it for the very first episode of deck analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another video. If you haven't had enough of me, you can check out my daily streams at twitch.tv/Shaman. I'll be back tomorrow with another video, so stay tuned for that, and